1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15 is where we'll pick up our study. This book this evening, as we've been working through this first of Paul's epistles, and it's early in a lot of senses. It's the earliest of the epistles themselves, and it's also early in the sense of he hasn't been really gone very long from Thessalonica before he begins to write this letter back to them. Maybe because of how close he had become to them and how dear they had become to him. There's I don't want to say like he cares for them more than he cares for other people, but there is a very special connection that they have together that has caused him to want to make sure he sends Timothy back to help and encourage them, and we'll see that before we're done, and to appreciate the fact that they're going to need encouragement for the challenges that they're facing as servants of God. And so we want to pick up in our study. Somebody mentioned to me, I think it was actually Jim, on his way out the other day, he said, the writer of the questions we've been using, he said, what translation was he using when he was writing the questions, because he's trying to match it. And so I believe the writer of the question using King James when he wrote the questions. And so I'm going to switch to that just because it'll help you make the connections easier if you're looking at your questions and you're looking at that. It'll give you a benefit, and I think that's kind of what Jim was leading me to anyway. So that's what I'm going to do as we continue our study together, just to help as you're looking at your questions and you look at these verses. They'll match it a little easier that way. And when we need to reference something, we'll do that as we move forward. In his reference to their imitation or their comparison to the churches in Judea, he said that they were very fitting, that they had, in Thessalonica, had been suffering some difficulties and changes, difficulties in relationship to the threats and challenges that were being presented to them. And even those Christians over in Judea had faced similar kinds of things. They were a very seriously troubled people. They had done what, according to verse 15? Okay, first they killed Jesus. That would have been sufficient enough to kind of illustrate the kind of people they were, right? And that would have been sufficient enough to kind of address how seriously troubled and challenged those Jews were about the work of Jesus. But really, he said the problem didn't really originate and or stop in some senses with Jesus, because who else had they killed? Their own prophets. Okay, anytime somebody presented an idea, a thought, a challenge to the way they thought, their general answer or response to that was, let's get rid of them, right? If we don't like it, we're going to get rid of them. So it didn't matter to them. To the extent, it didn't matter whether it was a prophet, and ultimately it didn't even matter if it was the Son of God who'd proven himself to be such. So they'd killed the Lord Jesus, they'd killed their own prophets, and then Paul says what? And they have persecuted, and that's an interesting word. He said they persecuted whom? And so the only other thing I can conclude from that is that Paul includes himself in that category. That's an interesting kind of thing, right? Because why? He was really in some ways the original instigator of all those difficulties. You recall when he was more known as Saul of Tarsus, he becomes the prominent persecutor of those who have become believers in Jesus. And undoubtedly at some point, though I don't know that we have some specific record of this, but obviously because of his reaction to those who were becoming believers in Jesus, Saul of Tarsus completely agreed with the idea of crucifying Jesus the Christ. I don't know that you go out and challenge anybody who's become a believer in him if you feel bad about what had occurred with Jesus in relationship to that. And in some senses, Paul was part of that problem. And now he becomes part of their hatred and their venom towards any of those who are believers in Jesus. We've come in contact with these challenges ourselves, and ultimately the result of that kind of conduct is what? You can't please God being that way. That's what he says. You can't please God. You're not honoring God. It was no honor to God to kill off the prophets. It was no honor to God to remove his only begotten Son. But he says it wasn't just the prophets, it wasn't just Jesus, it wasn't just us, but he says it's who? It's everybody. They're contrary with everybody. Lesson learned, man. Being contrary is not necessarily a good thing. I mean, there are some times where we must stand strongly and firmly where Scripture leads us. But to simply be contrary for contrary's sake is not a good quality to have. And here was folks that they weren't content in just kind of eradicating anything that was in opposition to Judaism, but they caused trouble for everybody, and they weren't content with it just in Judea. They would reach out and challenge Paul and others who were proclaiming Jesus in any fashion possible. You would wonder, why does a Jew care whether a Gentile believes in Jesus? You know, at the end of the day, you think about what effect does that have on them? Why would they even care? Yet they do. And they continue to be contrary to men everywhere because of it.
These people thought they was doing the will of God by killing these prophets of the Lord, persecuting all of them.
Certainly Saul felt that way. And he talks about his conscience in relationship to those things while they were going on. There are sordid and sundry reasons why folks were doing the things that they were doing and engaged in the challenges they were presenting towards Christians. Go ahead, Bob.
God said that Christ's death on the cross was a fulfillment not only of the law, but of the prophets.
Yeah.
So when he died, he fulfilled what the prophets had been speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. They were actually instruments of the very things they were trying to stop in a weird kind of paradox, if you will. And their challenges to the prophets were just absolute fulfillment. Their challenge ultimately to Jesus was absolute fulfillment of what they had been told was ultimately going to happen. But yet the light bulb never seemed to go off for some reason, at least among the leaders. But,
it's pretty hard for us to reason this out because we've never lived under those circumstances. Now, the Jewish people were looking for an earthly king. And so they didn't accept Jesus the Christ because he said he would have a spiritual kingdom. And so they were jealous because now they're reaching out to the Gentiles for something that they have rejected.
yeah.
So they're just trying to, one where it says contrary, one footnote said opposed. They were opposed to anybody that wanted to preach the gospel of Christ. So we might find that out before too many years at the same time of attitude by another nation.
Yeah.
But they still were looking for that earthly king, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that their difficulties and challenges they presented were far-reaching, and the reasonings were vast.
You know, this isn't the first time, really, that the attention has been drawn to the prophets and the killing of Jesus Christ. Recall Stephen made that accusation back in chapter 7 of Acts, about verse 52.
Right.
And it's one of the most scathing accusations I've ever read.
Yeah.
And they cut him to the heart.
Yeah. A poignant history lesson cost Stephen his life because he recalled to them the very things concerning the prophets and their very own history. And sometimes the truth hurts, and you can do one of two things with it, and they lashed out rather than actually recognizing it for the benefit it could have brought them. He said they were so contrary to them that they were forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles that they might be saved, to fill up their sins always, for the wrath is come upon them to the uttermost. And so, again, they're trying to challenge the Apostle Paul and his work, even among the Gentile world, not content and satisfied with just challenge it from the Judean standpoint, the Jewish standpoint. And you know, it's an interesting phrase. You know, at the end of the day, Paul says anyone who hinders the spread of the gospel is hindering souls from being what? From being saved, right? From being saved. That's the only thing that they have. From being saved is the only opportunity that they have, and the challenges continue. He says, for the wrath has come upon them even to the uttermost. If God's going to deal with this. And the consequences are going to come in relationship to the challenges that the Jews had brought. He said, "But we, brethren, being taken from you for a short time in presence, not in heart, endeavored the more abundantly to see your face with great desire." And so again, Paul even tells us that he hasn't been gone for what? Hasn't been gone for very long. It's been a short time, but he says, my heart's what? Yeah, my heart never left, okay? My presence, I had to physically get out of there for a period of time, but so I've not been present with you, but my heart has never left you. And his desire is to do what? He wants to go back, okay? Ultimately, his desire is to go back. Really, in some senses, is that not why the second missionary journey even began? Was Paul's desire to kind of return to those regions. Little did he know, though, that once he gets up into some of those regions, God's going to kind of, through the Spirit, kind of redirect his choosing. And he ends up over here in Europe and in Macedonia and Achaia particularly, and eventually ends up here in Thessalonica and on into Berea. But it's an interesting unfolding. But his heart's still there, and he still wants, his desire is to go back. And there's an obvious kinship between the two, and a tremendous relationship between him and the church there. And what exactly built that is some of the details aren't there.
He must have had a real strong influence on him.
Yeah, there's a very peculiar kind of relationship that was built for various reasons. And in fact, he says in verse 18, he would have done what? I would have come, but who was the problem? Satan. Satan hindered us. What I appreciate about that thought is that any time the gospel is being heard, really Satan's at the core. The reason why the gospel would be hindered, and Satan can use situations, Satan can use people, Satan can use anything in order to challenge the work and cause of Christ. And sometimes we have to acknowledge where the real problem is. We become very frustrated sometimes with people. And the truth is, people are a problem sometimes, right? Because I'm probably a problem sometimes, you're probably a problem sometimes. But I want us to recognize that sometimes we need to look a little deeper than just say, well, this person or this circumstance or that circumstance, and we're trying to figure out why did all these events unfold in the way they did. And the truth be known, Satan's at the root of all sinful actions and of all sinful behaviors and all challenges to the gospel. And defeating him really is the greater purpose, because if you can thwart his efforts, you can remove some of these other challenges.
One other thing I didn't say when we're talking about the Israelites, Jewish people, they had an intense hatred for the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And a dislike of them. So now, Paul, you're going to the Gentiles now, as having been a Jew yourself.
Yeah.
But, so there's, like you said a while ago, there's a lot of factors in why they're trying to hinder the gospel.
There's a lot of, I don't want to say, I guess irony may be the only word I've got, but there's, in the very idea that Paul was a devout Jew, Paul was a Pharisee among Pharisees, Paul sat at one of the greatest teachers at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the greatest teachers the Jewish people had. He was a Jew among Jews. And the Jew among Jews generally wouldn't want to go associate with him. The Gentile world. And we kind of know that to be true even from whose example? Which apostle? Peter, right? Because a vision has to come to Peter, and he has to be educated that if God says something, if someone deserves the gospel, then take the gospel. Nothing's common if God doesn't call it common. So even Peter had to learn that. And here's Paul, who at one point was entrenched in Judaism as deeply as you can be. And he becomes the great messenger into the Gentile world. And that's really kind of an interesting aspect of the work of the Apostle Paul when you consider it. Peter introduces it, I recognize that with Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. But it's Paul that takes the lead into the Gentile communities. But Satan's in the way. And so he says, for what is our hope, or joy, or crown of rejoicing? Are not even you or ye in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ when? At His coming. Paul says it's worth it all. Why? Yeah, because what's to come. Paul says, I'm willing to endure whatever it is we have to endure for that moment when you stand before God at the return of the Savior, and you're able to witness individuals whose lives you touched with the gospel. Doesn't mean you may not have been the first person, but I mean you had an effect on that person's decision to become a follower of Jesus. And you just take in your mind's eye for a moment that scene as collectively the saints of all ages are gathered together. And Paul says, when at the coming of Jesus, when He returns, and I see person after person after person who He had opportunity to share the gospel with, that's the crown. That's the joy and the hope that Paul is trusting in, and that keeps him established in all the work that he's doing. He recognizes there's a tremendous purpose here. And whatever he happens to have to endure in the process, so be it, because there's a greater purpose at hand. For you are, or ye are, our glory and joy. It's about the people that he's striving to teach and to share the message with. And when he sees that response and he sees them react to that message, and ultimately when he sees salvation be completely unfolded to them at the return of Jesus, it's a tremendous moment that Paul's yearning for. Even though he can't be physically present with them in the moment, which is what his desire is, he still longs for, even if it's at that moment that Jesus returns, where they come together. Thoughts or questions about the text? Grab your question sheets. Let's look at those together then. The questions for chapter 2. Again, if you have those stapled sheets, it'll be 2 or 3 sheets towards the end where the questions are. So he said, we speak not as pleasing whom? As pleasing men, but God. His purpose is not to please men. His purpose was to please God. And the only way to do that is to do what, Paul? Tell the what? Tell the truth about the gospel. It's the only way, anything other than telling folks the truth about the gospel is an effort to please men rather than pleasing God. He said, for neither at any time used we what? I never spelled this right properly. We'll give it a try. Flattering words. Okay. I didn't come in trying to entice you, persuade you with fancy talk, or just compliments and wooing you. I just brought the truth of the gospel and allowed for you to make a decision about how you would react to it. Paul was gentle among them, even as a what? Okay, a nurse, a nursing mother, depending on how you read that from. But even as a nurse, cherishing her children, which we'll see later in these questions as well. And what was the implication of that? It was gentle. Okay, the key word in that process was that he was gentle. That Paul recognized that when you're caring for individuals, sometimes a gentle approach is necessary in some circumstances. Everything can't be brute force. Everything can't be blunt. Everything can't be in that mode. Sometimes a gentle nature is what's necessary to nurture the moment. He said, for what is our what? Our hope, or joy, or crown of rejoicing. Okay. And what was that? They were, right? They were. Paul said the Thessalonians were his crown of rejoicing in the presence of Christ at his coming. Okay. At his coming. Again, the return of Jesus and ultimately salvation. Ultimate end. Paul labored night and day that he might not be burdensome to them. They know how holily, justly, and unblameably. You can read that, right? And that was all related to how he had what? Behaved, okay? Would it have been any value to Paul to go in there and preach to them the gospel of Jesus and then behave badly in front of them? No, it wouldn't have been no benefit. It is a crucial aspect of our proclamation of the gospel. And the truth of the matter is that I have anecdotally witnessed, even in my own life, where individuals who had tremendous understanding of the truth of the gospel, but had zero compassion, zero gentleness, zero ability by their own choosing in their manner and the way they conduct themselves. And it challenges the free flow of that message when that happens. Paul recognized that his behavior was just as crucial as the message he was presenting. So it was important for him to behave in holy ways, just ways, unblameable ways when he was among them. They became followers of the churches of God in Judea, right? We just talked about that a few moments ago. Paul's gentleness among them was as a nurse who cherishes her children, and the Thessalonians had been called unto his. What's the first word? Kingdom. I almost listened to it. Kingdom and glory, I think, are the two words in the text. So his entrance was not vain. His shamefully entreated, that happened over in Philippi, right? What was bold? I believe that was, and even in the face of much contention. God was connected to, if you read the text, it trieth our hearts, might have been, that's right, burdensome. He did not want to be such. Thank we God without ceasing, effectually worketh in you, suffered like things from your own countrymen. They please not God, contrary to all men, and fill up their sins. And that's the wrath of the uttermost that's coming. By the way, those were tricky. And why I say they were tricky is because you could have, if you were just random, just kind of looked at them, you probably could have matched all kinds of things together. So you really had to kind of get into the text and look at how the phrases were strung together to see what the connections were in that moment. Did Paul suffer immediately before coming to Thessalonica? Yes, he did. Where was he? Philippi, right? Did this suffering adversely affect Paul's preaching in Thessalonica? I thought that was a trick question, by the way, when I saw that, because if they're talking about did it personally affect Paul, I think the answer is no. That it did not personally affect him. Obviously, any kind of challenge to the process of preaching the gospel is going to adversely affect it. And so if you were thinking about the question in that sense, I could understand why you might say yes to that. But I think he was driving at the idea personally, and Paul said, I came in there and preached just like I would anywhere, despite the challenges that were going on. Name the things that show the pure motive of Paul's exhortation. Okay? Those are all fitting. What else? And we talked about those. What else did you see? This was, again, there were a half a dozen verses, really, that you could have extracted something from.
He didn't use flattering words.
Okay? He didn't use flattering words. There was a specific verse that referenced the concept of exhortation. And when it did, it referenced the fact that he did not use deceit, uncleanness, or guile. And so there was I didn't, for some reason I didn't jot down verse 3. So in verse 3 you'll see a specific connection to those things. What shows his gratitude? And that's a very generic question in some ways. Okay. I ended up concluding, because when he talks about how he gave what? I not only preached the gospel to you, but I gave him my own self. That's what I kind of looked at and saw as an explanation of his appreciation for them, that he would go to the extent of giving himself in that effort. Upon whom did Paul call to be his witnesses? Okay. Yeah, them and God himself in terms of his conduct. How strong was Paul's desire to impart the gospel on them? Okay. I looked at the idea. Remember how he was so willing to make sure he preached the gospel that he was willing to do what night and day? He's willing to work night and day. Remember, he said, "I'll work night and day to care for my needs, to be able to go ahead and preach to them." That's what I saw in that question. You may have saw something different. How do they receive the word of God? Okay, as the word from God, not from men. In what way had those of Judea persecuted saints?
Killed Jesus and the prophets.
All right, killed Jesus and the prophets. They caused problems for the apostles and were contrary and hostile towards everybody. The text told us. Had Paul endeavored to come unto them again? Yes, he had. But Satan, or who forbade their speaking, or Satan stopped him from that. Who forbade their speaking unto the Gentiles? I'm trying to stay away from answering it, and I did it twice. But it was Satan that stepped in the way. Two false questions then. Paul did not use a cloak of covetousness. That was true. Paul sought glory of the Thessalonians and others. That's false. Paul's desire for them was full of love. True. Paul exhorted, comforted, and charged them as a mother. That's a trick question. He did that as a father. If you look up the verses, he did those things as a father, not as a mother. And so the writer of the question's doing the old teacher routine there, trying to trip up the students, which is a real effective approach. But anyway, that one is false because it's father. They were charged to walk worthy of men. That's false. They received the word as of honest men. That's false as well. They received it as came from God. Paul said there was no need for him to come unto them once again and again. That's false. He wanted to come there. Paul's absence was for a long time in presence, not in heart. It was false. And Paul said, "Ye are our glory and joy." That's true. And Paul said that the Jews killed the Lord Jesus. That's true as well. Okay. Why is that significant, by the way? I know I'm just kind of getting through those, but why is it significant that he charges the Jews? Who actually put him on a cross? The Romans did. But at the end of the day, that Paul and others want folks to recognize that the real culpability in relationship to the death of Jesus was at the hands of the Jews. Romans don't even get involved if the Jews don't start the process. If they don't come before Pilate to begin with, it never gets into the hands of the Romans. And so ultimately the Jews are accountable for that, and that's something that Paul deemed important to share with them in that moment.
Well, Pilate even tried to give him a second chance.
Yeah. Yeah, in many senses, if you talk about at least Pilate's initial reaction, and there's, among the Romans, really there's kind of a desire to just kind of want to get away from this situation. But the Jews kept pressing. Okay, chapter 3. So, Paul's travels at this point, in terms of his narrative, as he's telling them the story, he says, they had arrived where? Ultimately, they had arrived at Athens. And he said, "Wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone. And so he sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith." Just quick history. What happened to Paul while he stayed in Athens alone? Okay. Remember, he tried really hard to just kind of wait, but he couldn't do it any longer. It burned within his heart, the text says. And he's on Mars Hill, and what's he see? Idol after idol after idol. Just statues and monuments to anything and everything, to the extent that there was one made to what? Unknown God. Here's a monument made just in case we missed one. Let's make sure we worship the unknown one as well. And that God that they didn't know, he says, Him I declare unto you, or Him I preach to you. And so here's this message that ultimately occurs. But that's, now you frame it. That's what he's referencing. And so when it was determined he would be left alone at Athens, he sent Timothy back, a minister of God and fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. I think that we can probably conclude that if Paul sends Timothy for the purpose of bringing comfort to them, that they're in some kind of what?
Distress.
Discomfort, right? Or distress. I mean, that there's a challenge going on, and it's affecting what? Or potentially could affect their faith. Because that's Paul's concern. Paul said, I sent Timothy, not just from some arbitrary reason. I sent Timothy, who's a fellow laborer in the gospel. He's a minister of God. He's a brother in Christ. And I sent him there because you needed comforted concerning the challenges to your faith. And to do that, what do you have to do? He said, to be able to establish you. Does faith come overnight? Active. It doesn't happen just in an instant. There is an initial spark of faith and belief that leads to certain actions. But fervent, long-lasting faith matures, grows. And really, it should do so in a never-ending kind of way. And so, Paul recognized that there was a need for him to send somebody back into Thessalonica to help get these folks established and rooted in the faith. What's the parable of the sower tell us happens if people aren't grounded and rooted the right way in faith? They wither and die, right? Or the bird's coming. It's gone before it ever really got a chance to germinate. The parable of the sower is a great illustration of what happens when folks don't establish themselves, grow roots in their faith. At the end of the day, who's responsible for that? I am, right? At the end of the day, if I don't have the kind of faith necessary, then at the end of the day, I'm accountable for that. But even with that personal accountability, there's a recognition, even from the Apostle Paul, that we need what? We're going to need help. And from the strongest to the weakest, at some point in time, we're all going to be subjects of needing help, and help with our faith. Real struggles, real issues, and with that, may I suggest to us, from a practical lesson standpoint, that it's okay for us to acknowledge I'm struggling with my faith. If I don't acknowledge it, what will happen? It'll just keep getting weaker. Right? Have you ever known a problem to get better by leaving it alone? Right? Now, you may be able to distance yourself from a problem, right? You may be able to do that, but it doesn't necessarily just go away until it's addressed and dealt with in something. Here's my point. If I'm struggling with my faith, I could deny it all day long. If I'm weak in my faith, if I have trouble in my belief, if I'm struggling with those kinds of spiritual challenges, it's not doing me any good to sit back and deny that, or to ignore that, or to be unwilling to admit it. I am no greater or lesser in the eyes of God by acknowledging the reality of my spiritual circumstance. But if I'm willing to open up and be honest about it, then the what? Then the help can come. Then the help can come. And so Paul recognizes they need help establishing themselves in the faith, receiving comfort in the face of the adversities, because if they don't get a little strength, they could go by the wayside pretty quick. Go ahead, Mark.
You know, he's basically trying to tell you that these trials are not disasters. You know, you can overcome them. And you overcome them and advance the cause and the purpose of God when you overcome it.
While we're family, in Christ, help each other out.
And the assistance we can provide to one another in that process. And I think what happens, Randy, sometimes is that we, even especially those who have been children of God for a long time, they almost feel ashamed, if you will, to even acknowledge that I've been a member of the church for 30 years. How is it even possible that I could have a moment of weakness of faith? How could I be struggling? But it happens. It happens. And so it's important for us to recognize that it's okay to reach out for help in spiritual things.
He also realized this is still a young congregation,
Yeah.
and they had a lot of going against him there.
Yeah. And if he doesn't get them established, it won't take long
They're lost.
for Satan to get a foothold there. Absolutely. That no man should be moved by these afflictions. There's the evidence of the challenges they were facing. For yourselves know that we are appointed thereunto. In other words, challenge, affliction, trial is going to what? It's going to happen. Okay. It's not a matter of if, it's always a matter of when. There's going to be, at some point, for some it may be more difficult. What might be my affliction may not be nearly as drastic in the eyes of men as others. But all of us in some moment in time are going to face some kind of affliction for the sole reason that I chose to be a genuine follower of Jesus. It's just a fact. That there will come a moment in time, there will be some instant in my life where something arises that challenges me, and the only reason I'm being challenged is because of my fervor and my dedication and my purpose in serving the Lord faithfully. It doesn't mean it's going to come in bunches. It doesn't mean it's always going to... But he implies here that it's inevitable at some point in time. And almost to the idea that we've been appointed to it. It's scheduled in that sense. Go ahead, Roger.
He told the elders at Ephesus the same thing.
Yeah.
It's inevitable that it's going to happen from within even.
Yeah. And so ground them, Timothy. Get them secure in the faith. Because these afflictions are going to mount and come. And they need to be ready prior. The best answer to any challenge is to be ready for it when? Ahead of time, right? Sometimes some things you cannot foresee, but some things you can. Some things you can kind of see what's going to be the reaction to the challenges, and how much prep we do before it comes gives us a tremendous advantage in that circumstance. For verily, when we were with you, we told you before that we should suffer tribulation, even as it came to pass, and you know. We told you it was going to happen. You saw it happen, just like we told you it was going to happen. These things were going to occur, and they've come to pass, and you've been witnesses to it. For this cause, when I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter have tempted you, and our labor be in vain. And so, Paul says, I waited about as long as I could what? As long as I could wait. I couldn't bear it anymore. You ever had some piece of information that you were just waiting on, and you just couldn't hardly stand it? And it's just eating you up, and you've just been waiting, and you're trying to find an answer, and you're waiting here for something. And you can't hardly stand it to the point where finally you have to do what? I got to do something about it, right? I got to make a phone call. I got to do something because it's just eating me up inside.
You keep saying, where they at?
Yeah, exactly. That's where Paul was. He hadn't heard anything about what had been going on in Thessalonica. Again, it illustrates how absolutely close they had become. That it is just eating him up inside. So he says, I couldn't stand it. I had to send somebody to know what's going on there in Thessalonica and to see about your faith, lest by some means the tempter have tempted you and our labor be in vain. I appreciate the fact that Paul was concerned about it. There's an encouragement that just comes from the knowing that Paul's, concerned about their well-being. He wants to know how you hold up through all these things. And he's so concerned about it because he knows the tempter's working his works. And he's doing the things that he does to persuade people. And Paul says, I'm so hopeful that my labor was what? Not in vain. He's so hopeful that he's not going to get word back from Thessalonica that it has all been destroyed. And the labor and work is in vain. Remember, on the heels of chapter 2, he said his longing was someday he would stand at the coming of the Lord and see what? See all these folks, right? And they would be a reward to him to see folks at Jesus' return and see them saved. In the end, the counter to that is the fear that all the work and labor night and day will come back empty if he hears that their faith has been destroyed since he's been gone. And so you can just imagine the mindset and the challenges he's got trying to work through all that anxiety, if you will, wondering what's happening.
Any preacher, when he preaches the word, is concerned about those that he teaches.
If you're not concerned about why,
That happened in the Old Testament. He couldn't wait for the prophet to come, and he went and offered the sacrifice himself.
Right.
He told the kids, wait for you, son. I can't wait for you.
So he ultimately decides that Timothy's got to go back. He's got to go back and see what's happening because Paul wants to know. He's genuinely concerned about their faith and condition in their relationship to Christ. And so he says in verse 6, but now when Timothy came from you unto us and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, and that ye have good remembrance of us always, desiring greatly to see us as we also to see you. And so Paul gets word back from Timothy and he goes, what? Takes a big breath. Because he gets good news that their faith is sound. I got good tidings of their faith, their love. There's a good remembrance of us. Can you imagine? He sends Timothy back and Timothy's looking around for these Christians and these folks that have been obedient to the gospel. And he says, hey, Paul wants to hear it. And they say, Paul, who's this Paul you're talking, but that's not the reaction. They want to see Paul just as much as he wants to see them. And you can just sense the relief that he must have been experiencing when he hears this good report that comes from that. Let's take an appreciation of that thought as well for a moment. It should encourage us when we hear good things about what's happening in the gospel and other places. Sometimes we forget, and we have a handful of men that we support outside of Paden City, and when there's a baptism in Brazil as it relates to the work of Dennis Allen, then you were just as much a part of that as anybody else was, right? And it should bring encouragement to us when we see the gospel, and even when we're not directly connected to their work. Even if we may not be financially supporting the preacher, if we just hear good things about what others are doing, and there's things that we can learn from other places. You guys are real good, I say you guys, people that travel, and inevitably when most of you travel somewhere, inevitably somebody brings me something. I don't know whether you're trying to tell me something or what, but somebody either brings me a sermon, you bring me a bulletin, you bring me some packet of info, you always send and it's great. Because what that does for me is it gives me an opportunity to see what other people are doing. And if they're having success in the gospel with the things they're doing, then we ought to learn from that. That's what I appreciate about the language that he's using here. Paul's encouraged when he hears about the good things that are happening in Thessalonica. And we can draw encouragement from the good things that happen, not just here at home, but among Christians anywhere, when good is happening in relationship to the cause of the gospel. So he says, therefore, brethren, we were comforted over you in all our affliction and distress by your faith. Paul was worried that they were faltering because of the afflictions they might be suffering. He said, what I heard from you actually strengthened me in our afflictions. In our challenges, in our difficulties, I was encouraged and uplifted to hear how wonderful you're handling them. And it's just an interesting relationship back and forth between the two. And here his hope was that he would send Timothy, what was the word? That he might comfort them. When he gets word back from Timothy, who ultimately got the comfort from this? Paul did. Paul ended up being the one comforted. He was the one that ended up being benefited when he got the word back from the good that was happening there in Thessalonica. I would challenge us to be that for others as well. I would challenge every congregation to be that, to be the kind of example. Remember, he talked about the fact that others hear about your work and your faith and your service. It's a good thing when a congregation of people have the kind of reputation where others can learn from. And others can be comforted by knowing the gospel is still at work in places. And that's what we should strive to want to be. To be the kind of example that others could benefit from, and to be willing to share whatever works, or to learn from others whatever's working for them. Autonomy doesn't mean no communication. Autonomy means you've got your own leadership. It doesn't mean you never have conversation or communication with other groups and might be able to help and strengthen one another in the cause of Christ. All right. Go ahead. You can talk. Go ahead. Save it. I thought I said something. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
Well, a lot of times preachers come and have meetings, and they don't see nothing happen then, but after they leave, they
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, things do see.
Right. And a lot of good can come, after. So you never know. And we're encouraged by anything that comes from the Word of God. All right, Lord willing, Sunday we'll come back there at verse 8.